Now, moving on to the positions as identified by Melanie Klein in her object relations theory. Now, these positions are created because of the infant's constant experience of the dichotomy um, of basic conflicts. And according to Melanie Klein, she identified that the first position is the paranoid-schizoid position. Now, this position is developed during the first 3 or 4 months of life. And you may be wondering, why is it termed as paranoid and schizoid position? Why are these terms utilized? Now, according to her, the paranoid schizoid position is a way of organizing experiences that includes both paranoid feelings of being persecuted and a splitting of internal and external objects into the good and the bad. Now, going back to the label paranoid, according to Melanie Klein, during the first 3 months or 4 months of life, the ego or the ego's perception of the external world is subjective and fantastic rather than objective and real. Meaning to say, the persecutory feelings are considered to be paranoid because there is that desire of the infant to control the breast by devouring and harboring it. Because for the infant, the nurturing and the caring experience must continue. And at the same time, the infant's innate destructive urges create fantasies of damaging the breast by biting, tearing, or annihilating it. Remember, there is that basic conflict of life and death instinct. So there are life instincts to promote life and the experience of good breast, while on the other hand, there are also destructive urges of damaging what is the so called source of nourishment. And because of these destructive urges, since the ego's perception is basically subjective and fantastic, these images are not based on any real or immediate danger from the outside world. Thus, the label paranoid. And the child must keep the good breast and the bad breast separate because to confuse them would be to risk annihilating the good breast, and there is no more nurturing and caring breast for the infant and losing it as a safe harbor. Now, moving on to the label schizoid. We know for a fact that schizoid as a label or as a personality disorder relates to people who are not engaging in emotional and social settings. They keep themselves detached from any interpersonal interaction. Now, in the young child's schizoid world, rage and destructive feelings are directed towards the bad breast, while feelings of love and comfort are associated with the good breast. So the schizoid label tries to also filter and separate the experiences of the bad breast from that of the good breast. And infants, of course, don't use language to identify the good and the bad or the good and the bad breasts. Rather, they have a biological predisposition to attach a positive value to nourishment and the life instinct and to assign a negative value to hunger and the death instinct. And this pre-verbal splitting of the world into good and the bad serves as a prototype for the subsequent development of ambivalent feelings toward a single person. So, meaning to say, there is that emergence of basic conflict, a dichotomy once again, that the mother's good breast and the bad breast are where the infant could be experiencing good and bad conditions. And imagine having to experience bad and good feelings for the same object or for the same person. But then again, the infant is not yet aware of this condition since they could only get to experience the good and the bad. And at this time, they could only be distinguishing that there is the presence of the good and there is also the presence of the bad. And Melanie Klein tried to also compare the infantile paranoid schizoid position to transference of feelings that therapy patients often develop toward their therapist. So, just like in therapy, um, clients could be under um, feelings of ambivalence, conflict, and guilt, and they may split the figure of the analyst, and then the analyst may at certain moments be loved, and at other times or moments they could be hated. And the analyst might be split such as a way that he or she remains to be good or bad as a figure, while someone else becomes the opposite figure. But ambivalent feelings, of course, are not just limited to therapy situations. Most people have both positive and negative feelings toward their loved ones. Conscious ambivalence, however, does not capture the essence of the paranoid schizoid position. So, in other words, the experience of the paranoid schizoid position of the infants all throughout, they are unconscious. It wouldn't be the same with our conscious ambivalence experience of love and hate with our loved ones. Now, other people may project their unconscious paranoid feelings onto others as a means of avoiding their own destruction by the malevolent breast. Still, others may project their unconscious positive feelings onto another person and see that person as being perfect while viewing themselves as empty or worthless. Moving on to the next position as identified by Melanie Klein, which is the depressive position. Now, the depressive position begins at about the 5th or the 6th month when an infant can already view an object as incorporated, such as good and bad feelings. So during this time, the infant develops more realistic picture of the mother and recognizes that she is an independent person who can be both good and bad. So there is already that conscious identification of the infant. Also, the ego is beginning to mature to the point at which it can tolerate some of its own destructive feelings rather than projecting them outward. However, the infant may realize that the mother might go away and be lost forever. Fearing the possible loss of the mother, the infant desires to protect her and to keep her from the dangers of its own destructive forces, especially those cannibalistic impulses that had previously been projected onto her, coming from the infant. Remember, there are these urges that are created in fantasy of trying to destroy and damage the breast by biting, tearing, or annihilating it. Now, since the infant's ego is now mature enough to realize that it lacks the capacity to protect the mother, and the infant experiences guilt for its previous destructive urges toward the mother. Now, these feelings of anxiety over losing a loved object, coupled with a sense of guilt for wanting to destroy that object, constitute what Klein called the depressive position. So, there is that fear of losing the object, which is the mother, and also that anxiety that is also coupled with the guilt feelings of the destructive desires by the infant. Now, children in the depressive position recognize that the loved object and the hated object are now one and the same, and they reproach themselves for the previous destructive urges toward their mother and desire to make reparation for these attacks. And because children see their mother as whole and also as being endangered, they are able to feel empathy for her, a quality that will be beneficial in the future interpersonal relations. So there is that conscious awareness that the mother could be the loved object and the hated object. They are one and the same. And to also resolve this depressive position, Melanie Klein identified that infants or children could be doing some reparation for their previous transgressions, and when they recognize that their mother will not go away permanently but will return after each departure, then that depressive position would be resolved. So when the depressive position is resolved, children close the split between the good and the bad mother, and they are able to not only experience love from their mother but also to display their own love for her. However, an incomplete resolution of the depressive position can result in the lack of trust, morbid mourning at the loss of a loved one, and a variety of other psychic disorders. So take a look at this flow chart. Now, there is that splitting because of the experience of good and bad, and here the infant could be here in this stage during the first 3 or 4 months where ambivalence is present and splitting would remain, leading to the paranoid-schizoid position. And likely relationships could be relating to the filtering of the bad and the good experiences. Now moving on to the 5th and the 6th month, the splitting would disappear, and the depressive position would be experienced. Now there is that conscious awareness of the infant or the child that the same object is causing him to experience both the good and the bad. And now with the reparation being done, it would be accepted by the child or the infant that the temporary absence or departure of the mother would only mean that it's not permanent. She will come back. And thus, with acceptance comes experience of love from the mother, and also the child in return would also be displaying their own love for her. Now let's go to the psychic defense mechanisms identified by Melanie Klein. Klein suggested that from very early infancy, children adopt several psychic defense mechanisms to protect their own ego against the anxiety aroused by their own destructive fantasies. These intense destructive feelings originate with oral sadistic anxieties concerning the breast, the dreaded destructive breast on the one hand, and the satisfying helpful breast on the other. And to control these anxieties, infants use several psychic defense mechanisms. And first on the list is introjection. Now, Klein simply meant that infants fantasize taking into their body those perceptions and experiences that they have had within the external object, which is the mother's breast. And introjection begins when an infant, during the first feeding, when there is an attempt to incorporate the mother's breast into the infant's body. Now, the infant tries to introject good objects to take them inside itself as a protection against anxiety. However, bad objects could also be incorporated into the infant's body, just like the bad penis, the bad breast, to also gain control over them. When these dangerous objects are introjected, they become internal persecutors, meaning they could be creating that urge of the destruction of the bad breast or the experience of the bad breast, capable of terrifying the infant and leaving frightening residues that may be experienced in dreams or an interest in fairy tales. Now, introjected objects are not accurate representations of the real objects, but are colored by children's fantasies. Like, for example, infants will fantasize that their mother is constantly present. That is, they feel that their mother is always inside their body. But the real mother, of course, is not perpetually present, but infants nevertheless devour her in fantasy so that she becomes a constant internal object. Now, second on the list of psychic defense mechanisms is projection. It's actually the same with our understanding of Freud's projection in his defense mechanisms, but let's try to also look into how projection would also be present among infants. Now, infants use introjection to take in both good and bad objects, and that is through the process of introjection. But they get to use projection as a psychic defense mechanism to get rid of them, to take them out, to take them all out. And projection is the fantasy that one's own feelings and impulses actually reside in another person and not within one's body. So think about a projector trying to rechannel the image to another material. And that is also the same with how projection would be happening among infants. They try to project it to another person, which is basically coming from their own feelings and impulses. And by projecting unmanageable destructive impulses onto external objects, infants alleviate the unbearable anxiety of being destroyed by dangerous internal forces. And children project both bad and good images onto external objects, especially their parents. Like, for example, a young boy who desires to castrate his father may instead project these castration fantasies onto his father, thus turning his castration wishes around and blaming his father for wanting to castrate him. So now, that castration desire of a young boy is being projected onto the father, and now the boy thinks that there is that desire of the father to castrate him. Um, People can also project good impulses, not just bad. And example, infants who feel good about their mother's nurturing breast will attribute their own feelings of goodness and to the breast and imagine that the breast is good. And adults sometimes project their own feelings of love onto another person and become convinced that the other person loves them. Projection thus allows people to believe that their own subjective opinions are true. Now, third on the list of psychic defense mechanisms as identified by Klein is splitting. Infants can only manage the good and the bad aspects of themselves and of external objects by splitting them. That is, by keeping apart incompatible impulses. In order to separate bad and good objects, the ego must itself be split. And thus, infants develop a picture of the good me and the bad me that enables them to deal with both pleasurable and destructive impulses toward external objects. Splitting can have either a positive or a negative effect on the child. If it is not extreme and rigid, it can be a positive and useful mechanism not only for infants but also for adults. It enables people to see both positive and negative aspects of themselves, to evaluate their behavior as good or bad, and to differentiate between likable and unlikable acquaintances. On the other hand, excessive and inflexible splitting can lead to pathological repression. For instance, if children's egos are too rigid to be split into good me and the bad me, they cannot introject bad experiences into the good ego, since there is that rigidity in the system. So they cannot be able to accept that there could be some bad me's. And when children can't accept their own bad behavior, they must then deal with destructive and terrifying impulses in the only way they can, which is repressing them, meaning relegating them back consciously into the unconscious. And through that process, again, when we try to understand the concept of psychoanalysis, its a main goal is also to identify that experience that is being repressed in order for the person to also be healed or be experiencing resolution in the different concerns or issues relating to his or her own life. Now, last on the list of the psychic defense mechanisms are or is the projective identification. It is a psychic defense mechanism in which infants split off unacceptable parts of themselves, project them into another object or another person, and finally introject them back into themselves in a changed or distorted form. Again, take note of the process. Infants split off unacceptable parts of themselves. It could be the bad experiences or urges that they have had and project them to another object or person. And finally, they would be introjecting them back only in a distorted or changed form. And by taking the object back into themselves, infants feel that they have become like that object, and that is, they identify with that object. Like, for example, infants typically split off parts of their destructive impulse and project them into the bad, frustrating breast. Next, they identify with the breast by introjecting it, and a process that permits them to gain control over the dreaded and the wonderful breast. Now, the projective identification exerts a powerful influence on adult interpersonal relations. Unlike simple projection, which can exist wholly in fantasy, projective identification exists only in the world of real interpersonal relationships. Like, for example, a husband with strong but unwanted tendencies to dominate others will project those feelings into his wife, whom he then sees as domineering. And the husband sadly tries to get his wife to become domineering, and he behaves with excessive submission in attempt to force his wife to display the very tendencies that he has deposited in her. Another example would be when people would say that the thinkers are the doers. So let's say, for example, through this process of projective identification, we know for a fact that the first um, step is to project the negative urges onto another object or person. So it could be the same with a husband trying to also push that the wife is cheating um, on him. But take note that it's the husband who is actually doing it, who is actually doing the cheating part. And he tries as much as possible to project that behavior onto the wife until such time that the wife would um, somehow consider the behavior to be unbearable, would fell in love with another person, and to also observe the process of identification in a distorted form. The husband tries to behave in a way that he would no longer be lovable, and to a point that it would also be a success on his end when he would later find out that the wife has cheated against him. So that is also a form of projective identification, just to try to rectify or redeem oneself with all the negative urges or destructive urges identified in the person. So let's go now to the three important internalizations as identified by Melanie Klein in her object relations theory. Now, when object relations theorists speak of internalizations, they mean that the person takes in introjects aspects of the external world and then organizes those introjections into a psychologically meaningful framework. In the Kleinian theory, three important internalizations are the ego, superego, and the Oedipus complex. So the ego, unlike Freud, who claims that the id dominates a child's unconscious, Klein believed that during this stage, the ego, though weak and unorganized, can already feel anxiety and is strong enough to use different psychic defense mechanisms. The ego matures through the first experience of feeding, providing him or her with love and security. And the ego can also split distinctions between good and bad breast, and as well as the objects and expectations. So, for example, when the ego experiences the good breast, it expects similar good experiences with other objects, such as its own fingers, a pacifier, or the father. And thus, the infant's first object relation, which is the breast, becomes the prototype not only for the ego's future development, but for the individual's later interpersonal relations. Now, moving to the superego, Klein claims that superego emerges much earlier in life, not as a result of revolved Oedipus complex, and is much more harsh and cruel. Klein further believes that early superego produces not guilt but terror to infants. Again, we may recall that in Freud's psychoanalysis, the emergence of the superego would only be um, possible when the child would be turning at around 5 years old through the concepts of good and bad that he or she has learned from his or her parents. But for Klein, the Oedipus complex could be more harsh and cruel on the experience of the presence of the superego um, through the emergence of terror in the life of the infants. Klein also insisted that the superego goes along with the development of the Oedipus complex and provides realistic guilt, which is the resolution of the complex. Now, the Oedipus complex, which is part of the internalizations under object relations theory. Now, even though Klein claimed that her idea of the Oedipus complex is an extension of Freud's, many distinct characteristics were recognizable. It begins at much earlier time of life. Significant part of it represents the child's fear of retaliation from his or her parents, the child's retention of positive feelings toward both parents, and it enables children to recognize between the good and the bad. Now, in Melanie Klein's form of psychotherapy, she developed play therapy technique as a substitute for Freud's dream analysis and free association, believing that children may express their unconscious wishes through toys and playthings. Klein's therapy is to reduce the depressive anxieties and persecutory fears and encourages her patients to re experience early emotions and fantasies and help them identify between reality and fantasy, conscious and the unconscious. And Melanie Klein also has this positive message in her object relations theory. She says feelings of love and gratitude arise directly and spontaneously in the baby in response to the love and care of his mother.